pregnant female. And keep in mind, every X-ray exposure, every X-ray procedure done poses some potential risk, right? And it's going to be part of the physician's job to determine a risk versus benefit of doing that procedure, right? If the risk of doing the thing is way higher than the benefit, we're probably not going to do the thing, right? Do the X-ray procedure. And in the case of pregnancy, the risk goes up relative to the benefit. So the benefit of doing the X-ray has got to be really, really high in order for us to actually perform that study. So it's always a risk-benefit analysis. The other reason why teratogenic effects came first is because they're just a little different. Some of them are stochastic, others demonstrate a threshold, they're deterministic. Some demonstrate a nonlinear, some demonstrate a linear response. So it's sort of just a complicated time. But I think if you can just remember that gestation, the periods during gestation pose a significant health risk if exposure happens during those stages, and the first trimester is the riskiest part. Okay, so if we can get those things down, I think we're doing okay. Let's move on now to talk about mutagenic effects. These are what we would sometimes call genetic effects. Okay, what I listed up here as when I said somatic or genetic for stochastic effects, we want to talk about these genetic ones. These effects that happen, laser pointer, from gamete exposure, from gonadal exposure. The reason why we shield the gonads during X-rays. Okay, so prior to fertilization. Important note here is that these effects are not super well understood. Partially because, it's just a complicated thing, right? We I went over with you guys in the previous classes about what DNA is, what it's for, and kind of how it does what it does, right? We talked about protein synthesis, right? We talked about the genetic code, right? The coding based on those nitrogenous base pairs. And it's just sort of a complicated thing. Like, we understand the genetic code, but we don't yet super well understand all of the mutations that happen, why they happen, when they happen, right? And the mutagenic effects are mutation-based effects. So we don't understand that whole thing super well. We can develop some correlations, though. I think that's important. Okay, but we have pretty good data from animal studies, mostly insects and mice. You think fruit flies and mice mostly, okay? Fruit flies are easy to do experiments on because you can get them really easily. You can have a lot of them in the experiments. They have short gestational periods, short lifespans, and you can pretty readily observe the effects that happen to them because we know what they're supposed to look like, right? They all kind of look one way, okay? So, conclusions from insect and mice studies on mutagenic effects. Dose response curve is definitely linear, non-threshold. That means a straight line, right? That demonstrates no threshold, meaning there's no safe amount of radiation to prevent a mutagenic effect from happening. Mutations happen no matter what you do. More of them happen when you expose to radiation, so there's no safe threshold. Any amount of radiation can cause a genetic mutation because we talked about the target theory, right? We talked about a hit, a deactivation of the portion of the genetic code, and that can happen with only a few ionizing events, right? So it can happen under very, very limited small exposure circumstances. So in principle, really any amount of exposure can cause harm to the DNA. This is the basis for radiation protection guidelines and the reduction in dose equivalent limits, which started in 1932 and were further locked in by 1959, and we still use these same dose equivalent limits today. But this is the basis for all of our radiation protection guidelines that we still use today, okay? This is why we say X-rays are harmful, right? And there is no safe amount of radiation. It would be kind of nice, though, right, if we could be like, here's the level that's safe, and if you stay below that level, you're fine, right? But unfortunately, it doesn't work like that, right, because of genetic mutations. So linear non-threshold. The effects are stochastic. This is squarely in the stochastic category. Notice genetic only appeared on the stochastic side. Genetic effects are not deterministic. They are entirely stochastic. They increase in frequency, but not in severity as dose increases. So more, given a population of people or a population of insects or mice in the case of these studies, more of those organisms demonstrate the effect, the mutation, when there's more radiation exposure. Less of them demonstrate the effect when there's less radiation exposure. So they likely have a control group with no X-ray exposure. They have some amount of genetic mutations occur. And then in the variable group with radiation exposure, more genetic mutations occurred. However, in order to reliably make happen, to continuously reliably make happen these genetic mutations, high doses of radiation were required to reliably cause that to happen. Okay, so they say the risk of induced genetic mutations at diagnostic radiation levels is negligible. That's important, but it's not the end of the story. Because these dose response curves demonstrate a linear non-threshold response, there's still no safe level. They say at diagnostic radiation levels, the possibility of inducing genetic mutations is negligible, not zero, right? Negligible means the chance of an extra genetic mutations happening is so low that we're not going to worry about it a lot, right? That's what they mean by negligible, but it's not zero. Okay, there is any amount of radiation can cause genetic mutations. It's just that we use very, very small amounts of radiation, which are kind of unlikely to cause these effects, but they're still possible. This is why we say not yet well understood, because it's not super clear. So if it feels like what we're saying is not super clear, it's because it isn't. Okay, it's the case. It's just biology is complicated, right? Things like physics and math, not that hard. I mean, it's hard, but like it's all very, very set in stone, right? For the most part, right? But biology, chemistry, these are sort of complicated, messy things, and especially when it gets to the level of biology, right? There's the organism, there's the environment, there's all these extra variables that happen. It's hard to say what's causing the harm, right? All we can do is build statistical significance. Okay. These are two photomicrographs done on rat testes, so male rats. After 5 grays of exposure, now 5 grays is quite a lot. If this were exposure to the whole body in a human, what's likely to happen? Death, right? That's above the LD 50/30 threshold, right? So LD 50/30 threshold is like 3.5 to 4 gray. This is 5 gray, but importantly, this is 5 grays of exposure to just the testes in a rat. Okay, so it probably didn't kill the animal. Okay, but it did cause permanent sterility in the animal. Okay. 5 grays of exposure show normal sperm cells clustered within follicles 1 week after exposure, but a severe decline in sperm cells at 3 weeks, which is the one on the right. So just a busier looking set of cells on the left than on the right. Because 1 week after exposure here on the left, already mature spermatozoa, it's hard to hurt them. Okay. However, the immature spermatogonia that will end up maturing, those got hurt, and so a few weeks later, there's less sperm around because of the mature stuff. The immature stuff is not there to mature anymore. It's estimated that mutagenic effects, these mutations to the gametes in the ova in the sperm or ovaries, excuse me. Sorry, the testes or ovaries of the organisms. It's expected that a 1% increase in mutations occurs for every 100 milligray delivered directly to the gonads of that individual. One additional mutation for every 10 gray delivered to a population, not a single individual. This 100 milligray keeps coming up. This is sort of the level at which things start to happen. Okay, it's not a threshold. It's not a hard threshold. There is no hard threshold for these mutagenic effects, but it is a type of threshold at which we see the effects increasing in probability. Biologists recommend that for exposures in excess of 100 milligray, this is for practical application now, for exposures in excess of 100 milligray, they say it's prudent to delay procreation for different time frames depending on sex. Females for a few days, think less than a ovarian cycle. Males for about 60 days. Okay. So for females, a few days because the oocytes exhibit constant radiosensitivity, but a capacity to genetically repair themselves. So translating that into English, egg cells are harmed by radiation, but can fix themselves. Okay. Spermatogonia, the already mature spermatozoa, hard to hurt them, but the spermatogonia that will mature, they are sensitive to radiation and can't fix themselves. Okay, so when they become damaged, it just takes time. They have to sort of cycle out of the system, and new ones have to be produced. Okay, so that 60-day wait is to wait for new mature sperm cells to be produced that were never exposed to radiation to start with. Okay, so far we've discussed teratogenic effects, exposures that happen in utero, and we said those demonstrate typically a threshold. Those demonstrate a nonlinear response as the effect gets worse with increasing exposure. We described 3 periods during the first trimester, right, with the germinal stage, the embryonic stage, and the beginnings of the fetal stage. Those 3 periods as being the biggest risk to the developing embryo or fetus. We then went on to say that there are other effects called mutagenic effects that we're just finishing up talking about. Mutagenic effects are random. They're so stochastic. They demonstrate no threshold. The response is linear. They are an all or none phenomenon. Either a mutation does happen or it doesn't. Okay. More mutations happen with more exposure to a given population. Again, the data from this is taken on studies from animals, okay, mice and flies. Moving on now to other types of. Now we're gonna move on now to late effects. These are all sort of late effects, but now we're going to talk about late effects that are somatic, not genetic. Okay, these are late effects that happen to an already existing organism after birth, exposure after birth, in other words. So we're going to talk about lifespan shortening first, at least. Lifespan shortening used to be an actual problem for radiation workers and radiologists. Okay, this is because we didn't have great radiation safety guidelines until people started to die from radiation exposure, until we started to notice at a statistically significant level that people that regularly worked around radiation and weren't using, radiation safety measures were just dying earlier than others. Okay, and this took until the 1930s because, think about, you're a physician. You're a physician right around the turn of the century, right around 1900. X-rays just got created, right? Just got discovered, 1895. You want to use this brand new thing, so you decide to specialize and become a radiologist. Okay, you're in your, if you're a newer physician around that time, you're in your late 20s, early 30s. Okay, you're not gonna die for a while, right? And we're not gonna have a chance to see if you die earlier than others for quite a long time. Okay. So it's up until the 30s, right? Until we start to see this really starting to happen. Radiologists dying earlier than other in this case, other physicians. We saw this done We saw this in other types of work too, in uranium miners and the radium watch dial painters and a number of other people. But in this case, physicians in the 30s. So in a 1930s study, radiologists exposed to high levels of radiation accumulated during their careers were shown to have lifespans averaging 5 years less than other medical doctors. We're not saying what they're dying from, we're just saying that compared to other doctors who didn't expose themselves to radiation regularly, radiologists were dying about 5 years earlier. So you can't, there's nothing that's saying why, but we're inferring that it's due to the radiation exposure, not to some other random other thing, right? Okay, so, but then we move on. By 1959, we'd locked down the rules for radiation safety, and from the 30s on, we'd sort of been using these same rules. So we'd been safe around radiation for a while by this point. By the 1960s, no difference at all was demonstrated in lifespan shortening for radiologists. So we got our stuff together, in other words, right? We started to get things figured out. No difference at all was demonstrated at current levels of occupational exposure. There is no evidence that lifespan expectancy for radiologists, or importantly for us, radiographers, is any shorter than other healthcare workers. Okay, so we're getting about the same lifespans as other people. We're not getting a shorter lifespan due to radiation exposure because we're using good principles of time, distance, and shielding, the cardinal rules of radiation safety. And interestingly, no lifespan shortening was observed in studies of the atomic bomb survivors or of radiographers during World War II. Atomic bomb survivors is an interesting one because they received high doses of radiation, so they all at once. So they were receiving any effects that they had were deterministic effects. Okay, we were not seeing the stochastic, random lifespan shortening, cancer-causing effects in those, primarily because their dose of radiation was acute, meaning all at once, and high. So the effect happened now. They either survived it or didn't, okay? And not like chronic, like these radiologists in the 30s who got up to the 30s who were just receiving low amounts of radiation for their, for 30 years, Okay. Even if we can't measure it, even if it is statistically insignificant, any amount of radiation exposure accumulated over your life is said to have a lifespan shortening effect, even if it's small. So they say, nonetheless, it's generally accepted that some degree of lifespan shortening occurs with cumulative exposures. That is to say, the more exposure you build up over time, the more likely you are to live a little bit of a shorter life. Interestingly, we can quantify this. Current estimates for lifetime radiation workers equates to about 12 days lost compared to the average. This is for the average radiation worker. So 12 days shorter life than the average person, which is like statistically negligible, right? I might live 12 days longer than you. You might live 12 days longer than me, even if we do the same job, right? Even if we do everything, you might have a twin who lives 12 days longer than you, right? If you do everything else the same, right? So this, like, statistically not super important, but it is still quantifiable. 12 days lost of life, 12 days shorter life than the average for radiation workers, compared to 74 days shorter on average for all occupational accidents, and 435 days shorter, which is over a year, for accidents in general. This is plotting lifespan of the average worker compared to radiation workers and other things. Lifespan shortening likely does not exceed 1 day per 10 milligray. So you can count, at the end of your radiation work, at the end of your career, you can count up your exposure, divide by 10 milligray, count up your exposure in milligray, divide by 10, and that'll tell you how many days you are going to, on average, have lost due to the job you chose, which is going to likely not exceed more than like 12 days on average. So it's almost nothing, right? Average cumulative lifetime exposure falls between 150 and 200 milligray, which, using those numbers, would be 15 to 20 days, roughly. We're talking less than a month, right? Compared to other jobs or other accidents in general, which would cause you to live a life about a year shorter than the average. So here's what's cool. What you can do is you can you can take an activity like smoking cigarettes and com- and put that call it a risk, to life, and give that an estimated loss of lifespan due to that risky thing. Okay, so we can say, like, for example, cigarette smokers, right, are gonna live on average 2,250 days shorter than non-cigarette smokers. Okay. Let me just go to the bottom of this. This was a study done in 1979. Okay, so this is an older study, but we like older studies. Nothing's really changed that much since then. So cigarette smoking, 2,250 days, estimated loss of life. Look at the very top one. It always makes me laugh. The very top one, the most risky thing you could do on this graph is being an unmarried male. Any ideas why? Taking more risks. And why are you going to take more risks if you're an unmarried person versus an unmarried person, or married? Why do you think you would be taking more risks if you are married versus unmarried? Yeah, you have like less. You don't. Being unmarried means it's less likely that you have a family, less likely that you have kids, less likely that you have anyone to like report to or take care of or have any responsibility for, right? Yeah, so being unmarried, male or female, poses a potential risk poses a potential risk to loss of life, and for the unmarried male, it's about 10 years. Okay, so an unmarried male, on average, based on this 1979 study, will live about 10 years shorter of a lifespan than a married male. Okay, right.
Now I would think it'd be the opposite way around.
Oh, maybe. The unmarried female, it's about 5 years. Okay, about 5 years shorter lifespan than the married female. For similar reasons, you're more likely to undergo riskier activities being unmarried than married based on this study. Cigarette smoking, male versus female, 2,250 days lost for the male, and versus roughly 800 days lost for female. They don't give a good explanation in this. They're just plotting the data, right, and giving us an answer. And then it drops off pretty significantly after those like first four kind of interesting ones about being unmarried and smoking. So like the two most risky things you could do based on this study is not being married and smoking. Okay, so if you're an unmarried smoker, then add those two things up, right? Okay, so then it goes down significantly, right? Like, so dangerous jobs, military, police, fire, construction workers, that's a very dangerous occupation, construction. On average, living about 300 days shorter than a not dangerous job, than not having a dangerous job. So 300 days is roughly, on order of magnitude, it's roughly a year, right? So a year shorter. Motor vehicle accidents, if you've ever gotten in a motor vehicle and been on the road in one, you are at risk for having a shorter life by about 200 days, okay, just because you got in a car, okay? And then there's another one I'm going to use here in a little while, I think. Maybe not. Oh, no, I think it might be on the same one. Yeah, it is. But it gives you estimated loss of life in minutes based on distances that you drive, which is kind of neat. So the further you drive, the shorter your life's going to be, on average. Alcohol, 130 days shorter, okay? So then we got all these other ones. Accidents at home, 95 days shorter, right? Average job. Look at where radiation job sits. It's like fifth or sixth from the bottom, 40 days shorter on average based on this 1979 study. So compared to everything else you can do, being a radiation worker, which really we're not radiation workers. I know we're using radiation, but the radiation worker has a definition of receiving a certain amount of radiation over a year's time, and you don't get that as an X-ray tech because you're behind a shield for most of the time. So anyways, but assuming you were a radiation worker, 40 days shorter. That's not that much. It's a month, right? Okay. Even the safest job, just working in general, 30 days shorter. Okay, so we're talking order of magnitude the same, right? Medical x-rays, if you've ever gotten a medical x-ray, 6 days shorter, okay, for every medical x-ray. All right. But you're going to lose 8 days just because you live on Earth and are exposed to natural radiation. So it's no big deal anyways, right? You're already going to lose some lifespan just because you're exposed to ionizing radiation, no matter what. This bottom one, estimated loss of lifespan in minutes, is kind of neat. Look at the top one. What's the top one? Buying a small car. Estimated loss of life, 7,000 minutes. I don't know how much that actually equates to, 7,000 minutes. You can do the math. But why is it riskier to buy a small car than a big car in this case? Yeah, they're talking about getting all smashed up, right? Now, this is 1979, okay? So a small car in 1979 is just going to be more dangerous than a big car in 1979 because there's just less metal around you to protect you, okay? Nowadays, with crash safety ratings and the National Institute for Highway Traffic and Safety, blah, 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 all that means that, cars are much safer now. But it's still, I mean, a big, safe car now is going to be safer than a small, safe car now, okay? But you make other considerations too, right? Like environmental considerations and cost and commuting and all that other stuff. Coast-to-coast drive, 1,000 minutes. Not the time it took you to drive across the coast, just the estimated loss of shortening of your life because you chose to drive from coast to coast because you're driving on roads, okay? But coast-to-coast flight, 100 minutes, okay? Notice that it is 10 times more risky to drive than fly, using their numbers here, right? I know like doors are just flying off of Boeing planes, but it's still safer to get in an airplane and have the door pop off of it than it is to hop in a car, okay? Smoking cigarettes, right? 10 minutes. Takes about 10 minutes to smoke a cigarette too, which is kind of interesting. The estimated loss of life is roughly the same as the time it takes you to smoke the cigarette, which I think is kind of funny. So for every cigarette, that 10 minutes you spent is going to cut off 10 minutes at the end of your life, on average. But your calorie-rich dessert, you lost almost an hour for every one of those cheesecakes you had, right? 50 minutes for every calorie-rich dessert. 15 minutes for every non-diet soft drink, okay? Going all the way down to the bottom now. Every 1 millirem of radiation, which millirem to microgray divide by 10? We're on an order of magnitude similar though. Millirems are other unit which would convert to sieverts. But 1.5 minutes for every 1 millirem. So we're talking very small amounts. The reason why we gave you all these other ones that are kind of funny, like crossing the street, not fastening your seatbelt, right, buying a small car, is so that you can see that there are other things that are much, much, much more risky, right, smoking a cigarette, than getting a little bit of radiation exposure, okay? Because we talk about radiation, we make it seem really harmful and scary, and it kind of is in some ways, but there are many other things that are way more risky than being around radiation, than using radiation in our medical applications. Medical x-rays are at the bottom of this list in loss of days, loss of life in days. There's 6 days, right? Exposure to radiation in millirem is at the bottom of this list in loss of life in minutes. So I think it's an interesting one. So they want you to note that on this survey, the listed loss of life expectancy for the average job, for a radiation job, and the safest job, right? The average job, 74 days lost for just an average job. 40 days lost for the radiation job, and compared to 30 days lost for the safest job. So we're trying to point out that there are other things that are much more risky than working around radiation, than receiving medical x-rays. Okay, so that's lifespan shortening. So the moral of the story is we're not living shorter lifespans because we're around x-rays nowadays, unless we're building up high amounts of radiation over our lifespans, and we can equate roughly 1 day for every 10 milligray. Okay, moving on. Our next effect is cataract. Cataract is a clouding of the lens of the eye. It shows a threshold. So this is one of those exceptions. There's been a few exceptions today. Remember, late effects are mostly stochastic, Late effects are mostly non-threshold and linear. This is an example of a late effect, doesn't happen for years, 15 years down the line, that does demonstrate a deterministic threshold. So threshold is 2 gray for a single exposure, 10 gray if fractionated. What's that? We talked about that term fractionation last time. What's fractionation? What? Yeah, separating an exposure over periods of time, right? So if 2 gray would cause cataract all at once, it wouldn't cause cataract if you split it up over a long period of time. But 10 gray over many exposures would. Cataract has a latent period averaging 15 years. Interestingly, when exposure happens at older ages, the latent period is shorter and the cataract becomes more severe. So the period of time between exposure and developing the cataract is shorter with age, so it's an inverse relationship, and shows more severity. They got a lot of this data from nuclear physicists, particle physicists, people working around radiation, high levels of radiation. Medical workers demonstrate a significantly lower rate of this, because, I mean, 2 gray is a lot, right? 2 gray is life-threatening, right? 10 gray is also a lot, even if fractionated over time. You're not going to get 10 gray of exposure over your lifetime. You're going to get a couple of 100 milligray, like maximum, okay? So radiation physicists, though, those are the ones who this data was mostly taken from. You'll see many radiographers, radiologists wearing leaded eye protection when they're working around fluoroscopy, our video x-ray machines. Eye protection is not necessary for routine radiography, but cardiovascular, interventional fluoroscopy, regular fluoroscopy, those things done on a daily basis, it's now pretty common to see people using some form of eye protection. So usually we wear leaded glass lenses that protect from the front as well as the sides, because we often turn our heads to the primary beam, or to the scattered X-ray beam. Okay, so cataract of the lens of the eye. Okay, the big one, cancer, carcinogenesis. So this is one of the biggest late effects. This is like the shining example of a late effect of radiation, cancer. So it's important to know, this number always is impressive to me. The general risk of developing some form of cancer, so let me be clear, this is not the risk of dying from cancer. This is the risk of developing some form of cancer in your lifetime is 1 in 3, okay? There's order of magnitude 30 people in this classroom, okay? 10 of us are gonna get cancer sometime in our life. That's just probably gonna happen. 1 in 3 people will develop cancer in their life, no matter what we do, okay? It's an unfortunate number, but it's true, okay? So, it is also true that increases in, so that's regardless. Even if we were just regular old people not working around radiation ever, that's gonna happen. That's just for the general public, okay? 1 in 3. It's estimated that for every 100 milligray of exposure, the cancer risk increases by about 1%, okay? You're gonna receive maybe 200 maximum milligray, let's call it 500 milligray, okay? To just go way above what you're probably gonna get, that's a 5% increase. That's it takes your chance of developing cancer from 33% to 38%. Still not a 50% chance. It's not a coin flips chance, okay? Still pretty high though, right? It's a 3-sided coin, right? So it's still pretty high, but we're increasing by a small amount when we give radiation, when we increase our exposure to radiation. Consider this for yourselves, but also consider this for the patients that we work with too, right? They have a chance of developing cancer that's about 1 in 3, and any exposure of 100 milligray or more increases cancer risk by about 1% for roughly every 100 milligray. And there are not like routine diagnostic exams, but there are fluoroscopic exams, there are computed tomography exams that give patients order of magnitude 100 or more milligray for that exposure. So there are procedures that are done which will increase people's chance of developing cancer by a measurable amount. So it's not without risk, right? Current levels for radiation workers, us, we'll categorize ourselves in this case as a radiation worker, with the caveat that, you know, it's not really the case. But the current level for radiation workers is so low that the risk is undetectable, courtesy of the NCRP telling us that. But that's cold comfort, right? Because we already, just because we're people, have a 1 in 3 chance of developing cancer. So even if our cancer risk doesn't go up, it's just already there to begin with, just because we're here. Good. This is one reason why, as we repetitively say, the risk level of developing cancer when being an X-ray technician or radiographer is similar to other safe industries, because we're not measurably increasing our exposure to radiation. I mean, maybe 1% increase, right? We're talking 1 or 2. I gave it the highest possible. Like, you're not going to get more than 500 milligray in your life. Given that, you'd be increasing by 5%. Okay, and that's way, way, way above what you actually will end up getting in your lifetime. And notice they're not specific here. They're not saying a specific type of cancers. They're just saying 1 in 3, we're going to develop some kind of cancer. Please.
So what if you're a carrier of cancer?
How do you mean?
So your chances are higher?
Because you have the oncogene for cancers, then your chance is just higher. It's already statistically higher, right? When they say the average is about 33%, some people's chances is coin flip or more, right? Other people's chances are a lot lower, right? So the average is about 33%. To have that average, that means there's going to be people with a lot higher risk and a lot lower risk. Yeah. So if you're one of those people with the higher risk, then you have to consider that you're already at a higher risk. Yeah. You know, you're at higher risk because your parents or grandparents or something like that, right? Breast cancer is a big one in females, right? Ovarian cancer especially too, right? And that's it's hereditary. Yeah. Yep. So that already puts you at higher risk if you're in that category. Okay. Let's talk about a couple of different, and this is like semi-specific because there's obviously like much more specific types of lung cancers, different types. But let's just like lump lung cancer into one category. So lung cancer, cancer of the parenchyma of the lungs, the lung tissue. We say some increased risk of developing lung cancer was found in early radiologists and atomic bomb survivors. At current occupational exposure levels, no evidence for increased risk among radiographers or radiologists. And that's important, right? It gives you historical context that early on, some people working around high levels of radiation showed increased risk. Radiologists and atomic bomb survivors, I know they weren't working around it, but the atomic bomb survivors were exposed. But at current levels, because we use time-distance shielding, we have engineering controls, our buildings are built correctly, all of these things mean, and we got good protocols in place, all these things mean that our risks of developing certain cancers, in this case lung cancer, are about the same as the average person. However, early on, as we keep referring to, early on, like the mid-20th century, mid-1900s uranium miners, nearly half of all their deaths were attributed to lung cancer due to radiation exposure. 50% of them died from radiation exposure. So that's a pretty high amount relative to the 33% on average. Cigarettes can deliver more than 50 milligray per year to the lungs, which is one reason why we talk about cigarettes as being carcinogenic, cancer-causing. And remember, the problem with the lung tissue is that any radioactive materials inhaled into the lungs will continue, as long as the half-life of the material is lasting, will continue to emit radioactive particles into the lung tissue. And remember, the problem with particulate radiation, alpha and beta radiation, is that it is non-penetrating, right? That it has a high linear energy transfer, that it transfers its energy into the first thing that it hits, the lung tissue, right? And it doesn't travel outside of the lungs. All the damage is happening locally in the lung tissue. Right? So it's really harmful for the lungs, especially cigarettes. Lead and polonium in the cigarettes, very harmful. That's why we're getting 50 milligray, by the way, per year. So if you're a regular cigarette smoker, pack a day, 2 packs a day, and then the kind of heavy cigarette smoker levels, 50 milligray per year is your annual dose equivalent limit for radiography, right? That 50 milligray is the maximum you're allowed to receive yearly as a radiographer. A smoker could in principle be receiving that every year, hitting their maximum. Now, you guys never get close to your maximum, okay? Behind your shield, behind your lead window and wall, but a smoker could do that pretty easily, and that radiation exposure is all concentrated in the lung tissue. One of the biggest cancer risks, especially in the United States, is skin cancers. Our skin cancers. They say near epidemic proportions in the United States. This is from ultraviolet radiation. There's 3 types. We can put UV ultraviolet into 3 categories: UVA, B, and C. UVC is what we call sub-ionizing, meaning it's not harmful enough to cause ionizations in the body. It still has some harmful effects potentially, but it's sub-ionizing. But UVA and UVB are harmful and are ionizing types of radiation that you can't see, touch, taste, or feel, or smell, right? Yeah. And we get them from we get this from sun exposure. We also get this from tanning booths too. Tanning booths are the worst because they pretty much exclusively give you just the wavelengths of radiation, that are necessary to tan your skin, right? Which are the ultraviolet wavelengths. So, I mean, I wouldn't say like never use a tanning booth, but I would say like use with caution, right? The people that regularly use them are regularly exposing their whole, and that's the other thing too. It's like whole body, right? Whole body to UVA and UVB, which are both ionizing forms of radiation. It's like sitting in a microwave cooking yourself, and to get the nice skin tan. And I understand why people want to do that because it's quicker and easier than going to outdoors. But at least in the outdoors, what you're exposed to is full spectrum, right? You get everything from the sun, all the way from infrared all the way to ultraviolet, right? The tanning booth's a very narrow range. You're just receiving the harmful stuff. Skin cancer has a latent period of 5 to 10 years. So you're not going to know 10 years later if the skin cancer you got was from all those tanning booth days, but you can say that what you could say is that those tanning booth days increased my chance of developing the skin cancer. Like if I developed skin cancer and I spent, every weekend in going to a tanning booth for years in my 20s or whatever, then it's high likelihood that was a contributing factor. Skin cancer shows a threshold, but a linear response. So that's sort of an exception, right? Most late forms of radiation effects demonstrate a no threshold. This one has I don't know what the threshold is, but this one has a threshold. Okay, so again, there are plenty of exceptions all over the place, right? Exceptions to our general rules. Threshold, but a linear response in this case. And of the types of cancer that we're likely to develop in our lifetime, skin cancer is one of the highest likelihoods. It's more likely to develop skin cancer than a lot of other forms. Radiodermatitis leading to skin cancer was a big problem in early radiation use. primarily because we didn't have good beam filtration. So nowadays, what we do with the X-ray beam is we produce the X-ray beam and then we filter it. Okay, it's kind of like taking a flashlight and then putting a cover over the flashlight so that only like one color of light comes out of the flashlight. Yeah, it's similar way in the X-ray room. We take our X-ray beam and we put in front of it an aluminum filter. It's a little sheet of like a coin of, it looks like a coin of aluminum sometimes. Other times it's like a square, but it's a piece of aluminum that the X-ray beam has to pass through. Okay, and what it'll do is it'll filter out some of the radiation that would otherwise only contribute to skin exposure and would not contribute to the diagnostic image. Prior to that happening, it was pretty common to develop skin burns on the body parts that were exposed to radiation. We call that erythema of the skin, and the effect is called radiodermatitis, skin inflammation due to radiation exposure. Reddening and roughening of the skin due to radiation exposure, in severe cases causing ulcers, and chronic dermatitis was a precursor to skin cancer. This is how Clarence Daly died, the first guy that died from radiation exposure, Thomas Edison's assistant. He was constantly putting his hand in the way of the primary X-ray beam because someone had to put their hand in the way and do the experiments, and Edison was busy, operating the machine. So Clarence Daly used his hands, and he ended up dying from skin cancer that metastasized to the rest of his body after having his hands amputated. So I don't believe this is Daly's hands. I don't think so, because I've seen Daly's hands. They don't look like this. But this is radiodermatitis on the top. On the bottom, these are skin ulcers forming from the radiodermatitis. Chronic exposure, chronic dermatitis due to exposure will lead to skin cancer. Okay. Lots of unfortunate accidents in the past. This is another one of them. It's one of my favorites. I don't like that people died from radiation exposure, but this is one of the ones that I think is like, there's just an obvious cause and effect here. Bone cancers. So the best data on bone cancer from radiation exposure was obtained from watch dial painters. Okay, so it's nice when you have a watch that you can see at nighttime, right? Now nowadays, you have a digital watch to turn on a little light, right? But an analog watch with hands, right? We have glow-in-the-dark hands. All they need to do is be exposed to sunlight, and they absorb the sunlight energy, and then you go to a dark room, and the watch kind of glows like any other glow-in-the-dark toy would, right? But before we knew really how harmful certain forms of radiation were, one form of radiation that would glow is called radium, okay? And you would, with a very careful technique, you could paint radium onto the dial of a watch, okay? Then you could have a watch that you could see in the dark, all right? So you have a glow-in-the-dark watch, it's 30s and 40s. It was always women who were the people who were the watch dial painters, and these women would take and they would paint the watch dials with radium so they would glow in the dark. But in order to do that, watch dials are very thin, okay? So they would take their little paintbrush and they would dip it to clean it off, right? And before they would dip it back in the radium, they would lick it on the tip of their tongue, okay? To kind of get the paintbrush to kind of go nice and fine, and then they could dip it in the radium and paint more radium onto the watch dials. So they were regularly ingesting radium sulfate, but radium, and getting huge amounts of radiation into their body, huge amounts of particulate radiation into their body, natural radiation, constantly ingesting it. So glow-in-the-dark watches and meter dials with radium sulfate, consistently ingesting radium by licking their brush tips to form a fine point. And this is crazy, their accumulated career doses were as high as 500 gray, which again, 500 gray is over 100 times more than the LD 5030. They were just getting it over long periods of time. That's how they were able to get such high doses. The relative risk for developing bone cancers was 122 to 1. They were 122 times more likely to develop bone cancer than the average person. So they were very statistically likely to develop these forms of cancer, the bone cancers. Yeah, so they would lick the brush tip. The radioactive material would dissolve on the mucous membrane of their tongue, because the mouth is a mucous membrane, and go right into the bloodstream, circulate around the body, and these radioactive materials would just park themselves different places in the body and cause harm, cause cancers. In this case, bone cancer. The next one's thyroid cancer. So the thyroid is an interesting one. The thyroid requires iodine to work, and radioactive forms of iodine can get taken in by the thyroid, and the thyroid can effectively expose itself to high amounts of radiation because of exposure to radioactive iodine, which is one of the byproducts of nuclear weapons. But anyways, in this case, thyroid cancer, best data for thyroid cancer is taken from treatment of children with an enlarged thymus gland. You guys know where the thymus gland is in the body? It's not the thyroid, the thymus. The thymus is right here in the chest. Okay, it's right above the heart. And it's part of your immune defense, especially in early childhood. And so the enlarged thymus gland was treated and with radiation and gave children thyroid cancer, unfortunately. So that and a study of South Pacific children exposed to nuclear fallout from atomic bomb tests in the mid-20th century. This is unfortunate because these are groups of people that were exposed to nuclear fallout, not from, I mean, it's also bad that they get exposed to nuclear fallout from weapons used during war or in war, but these are just from the tests, right? The tests we did in the South Pacific. Those videos you see, if you've ever seen videos of atomic bombs exploding in the ocean, black and white videos, those are the South Pacific atomic bomb tests. I think they only did a couple of them. They did it to make sure their weapons worked. Okay, but unfortunately, those ginormous mushroom clouds of radioactive material that they blew into the atmosphere, those blew around, and the nearby islands, those materials just fell. That's what fallout is, fell onto the nearby islands. Okay, and so you get children exposed to everyone, but children were harmed more. And so thyroid cancers. They were able to take data based on the level of thyroid cancers in children being treated for thymus gland enlargement, as well as children who were exposed to nuclear fallout in the mid-20th century. And they were able to determine that radiation exposure increases your risk for thyroid cancer. Primarily because, in this case, it was because of particulate radiation, so not the electromagnetic X-rays that we use, but particles, alpha, beta, and gamma. Thyroid cancers were found to have a latent period of 10 to 20 years, and there was an association between particulate radiation exposure and developing thyroid cancer. Thyroid cancer is found to have a latent period of 10 to 20 years. And then another form of thyroid cancer that happened was, I told you iodine. So one of your thyroid hormones, triiodothyronine, requires iodine to make it. Your body needs iodine to make it. So your thyroid will take up iodine into it. And if you take in radioactive iodine, it'll go right to the thyroid and start emitting radiation into the thyroid. And so the use of iodine 131 was used to treat hyperthyroidism, to shrink the thyroid, with the effect that it gave the thyroid cancer. So instead of shrinking the thyroid, it would give them cancer. Yeah, so we learn, right? We try things and we learn. Yes, so interestingly, nowadays, one thing that can be done during a nuclear incident, if you know you're going to be exposed to large amounts of radiation, is that you can take iodine pills and then basically saturate your body with iodine, and that way your body won't take up any of the radioactive iodine that comes as a product of the nuclear fallout. So if you want advice on prepping for the end of the world, have iodine pills handy. Prevent thyroid cancer. But yeah, so the reason why the thyroid is on this list of things that are cancer risks is because, well, one, thyroid cancers happen, but thyroid cancers happen more than other types of cancers because the thyroid is a glandular tissue. Okay, and what did Bergoni and Trabando say about cell sensitivity? What are the two things they said? What makes a cell more sensitive to radiation? Maturity and that's the same thing. So differentiation, maturity, we'll put in the same bucket. So the other thing was rate of mitosis, right? How rapidly it divides and how it differentiated it is. Well, glandular tissue has more undifferentiated cells that divide more rapidly than other body tissues. Primarily in the case of glandular tissue and the thyroid, it's the rate of mitosis. So thyroid tissues are highly mitotic. Glandular tissues are all highly mitotic. Think about all the cancers you've heard about. A lot of them are gland-based. I mean, breast cancers, right? Ductal carcinomas, those breast cancers are arising from glandular tissues in the breast, right? Similarly with ovarian cancers, the ovaries are glandular tissues. What do glands do? They make secretions, right? The ovaries are endocrine organs, right? The estrogen, progesterone, right? These are endocrine organs. These glandular tissues are more at risk for developing cancers than non-glandular tissues. Okay, thyroid being one of these glandular tissues in our body. So, already at risk for developing cancer, and you expose it to radioactive materials, the risk goes up. That's the point. Okay, good. And we have data from mostly children, mostly from thymus gland treatments, and mostly from atomic bomb fallout survival. Last note on thyroid cancer. One occupational study in the 1980s suggests a possible increase in thyroid cancer among radiology residents, which led to a wraparound shield being developed for the thyroid, which then became common use among radiologists and radiographers during cardiovascular and angiographic fluoroscopy. And nowadays, radiologists pretty much wear these thyroid shields anytime they're performing fluoroscopic or any interventional procedure where they have the beam on and their bedside with the patient, thyroid shields. You often see them thyroid shields, full lead apron, and glasses just to be extra safe. But thyroid shields were developed because of an association with radiation exposure and thyroid cancer. Side note, thyroid shields are not gonad shields. I've been in offices that I ask to see their gonad shields and they hold up a thyroid shield. Those are completely different things. I'll talk to you guys about shielding in Radiation Safety 3, our next module, okay? Thyroid shields are a different kind of thing. They have a strap and they wrap around the neck. They're shaped like a gonad shield, but they have the wraparound part of it that holds it in place. Okay. Let's move on. Another late effect. Another late effect is leukemia. Leukemia is a form of blood cancer. We know that it deals with white blood cells because in the name leukemia we see leuko or leuc show up, meaning white. It's a system-wide problem. It's a whole body problem because the blood circulates everywhere, and it requires the least dose to manifest itself. High doses of radiation can suppress the production of erythrocytes, red cells, lymphocytes, lymphatic immune cells, in the bone marrow, but leukocytes continue to accumulate relentlessly, overwhelming the system. Having a 4 to 7 year latent period, individuals exposed to high levels of radiation remain at risk for up to 20 years. Atomic bomb survivors had a 3-to-1 relative risk for developing leukemia. This means that an atomic bomb survivor was 3 times more likely than the average person to develop leukemia. This went up. Do I have the rates for children? No. This went up, though, if you were a child, because you're more radiosensitive as a child. Patients undergoing numerous high-level diagnostic exams in their lifetime, and this one's important for radiographers, right? We don't deal with atomic bomb survivors very much at all, right? But we do deal with patients who get high-level diagnostic exams regularly. People who receive numerous high-level diagnostic exams in their life may demonstrate an increase in risk of 12% for developing leukemia. Early radiologists with 10 to 20 times the modern exposure levels showed rates of leukemia well above other medical doctors. But importantly, because we care about what's happening now, higher rates for radiographers and modern radiologists have not been demonstrated. Again, primarily because, as you'll learn in Radiation Safety 3, our next module, we're pretty good about limiting our exposure to radiation, maximizing our distance, maximizing our shielding from radiation. We're pretty good about using radiation safety principles to keep ourselves safe. But it's only because we're good at using these radiation safety principles that we're not seeing these things show up at any statistically significant level any longer. Okay. Let's move on. We're going to go to our last set of late effects, breast cancers. Now, this is going to be breast cancer in the context of mammography, which is used to detect breast cancer, okay? But you've learned that radiation can cause cancer, right? It can be a factor in causing cancer. More is worse, right? And you learned just a little bit ago that glandular tissues are at higher risk for developing cancers than non-glandular tissues. So now we have a glandular tissue, like the breast, being exposed to levels of radiation, and we're using those radiation exposures to check for cancers. So you see the problem here, right? So there's got to be a good way to do this, though, right? So let's take a look at this. So during the 1960s, direct exposure and zero mammography methods required high radiographic techniques with a relative risk for women under 40 years of age, ranging from 3 to 1 up to 10 to 1 risk of developing cancers. It was risky, very risky, to get a mammography. So mammography was done when it was beneficial, right? When the benefit of doing the mammogram was as high or higher than the risk of doing the mammogram. 1976 study finds that the average dose at that time for a mammogram was 20 milligray per breast per exam, leading to an excess risk of 370 cancers and 148 deaths per million in patients per year. So 370 extra cancers, 148 extra deaths per million. And then they concluded at that time that the risk of mammograms outweighed the benefit. The risk of doing it, risk of developing cancer from receiving mammograms was high compared to the benefit of detecting cancer. So you were more likely to cause cancer than detect it in that way. But 1978 comes along, new technology, new screen film technology, reducing dose drastically. And so here's the problem with mammography. Mammography uses very low kilovoltage and very high mass. Okay, so if you're newish to this, the idea with the X-ray beam is we set its energy, how strong it is, and we set how much of it we use. Those are kVp and mass. kVp sets the X-ray beam's energy, kilovoltage peak or kVp sets the X-ray beam's energy, and the number mass sets how many X-rays we're producing, how much of the X-ray beam is there. Okay, mammograms required low kVp, so low energy, but a lot of radiation. Okay, we also associate kVp with penetration, right? The higher that kVp number is, the more penetrating those X-rays are. And you've learned so far that penetration is good for X-rays, right? We want them to pass through the body, otherwise they stay in the body, right? Well, with mammograms, we use very low kV, very low penetration, so the radiation, more of it absorbs within the patient than passes through the patient, okay? And this is done so we could achieve high contrast on our images, so we could see these ductal masses, these cancers more easily. So we were using large amounts of radiation with low penetration power, and so it's leading to high breast doses for mammograms. So they say due to the extremely low, about 26 kVp, entrance skin exposures can be misleading for mammography. With low penetration, glandular dose averages about 15% above the entrance skin exposure. Sorry, about 15% of the entrance skin exposure. Much higher compared to other diagnostic studies. Again, the point is that they're absorbing for mammograms relative to other diagnostic studies. Mammograms, you absorb more of the radiation than compared to other studies. More of it stays in your body, in other words. One way to, and this is not a lot can be done about this, okay? We can't really change the KV because we need the high contrast, okay? But what we can do, and what we have done, as you saw at the 1978 note, is to build more sensitive detectors, okay? Build image receptors, in those days it was film, but nowadays digital, to build detectors that are much more sensitive to radiation so that we can achieve our images, so we can produce our images with lower radiation doses, lower overall radiation doses. If we have to use low KVP, let's use lower amounts of radiation too, okay? And that can be done by making better and better image receptors. So nowadays it's a little more safe. Couple things were done, as well as building better detectors, couple things were done recommendation-wise, policy-wise, to help reduce the breast dose for mammograms. And that is, one, recommending a routine for mammograms. 2 projections only, okay? With an additional axillary projection only added when clinically essential. So only 2 projections, limiting the amount of views that we take. And current recommendations on limiting exposure include 3 milligray per view or up to 12 milligray per exam. So now we're sort of giving you a recommended limit for exposure for these exams. Additionally, some guidelines have been put out giving recommendations on when in life these mammograms should be happening. At what point in life female should begin to receive mammograms. So for asymptomatic women, people with no detectable lumps on a self-breast exam, no other risk factors, women between age 40 and 44 should have the option to start screening with a mammogram every year. So if you're under 40, there's just no need to do it. But between 40 and 44, that's when we recommend, hey, you should start to consider it, okay? 45 to 54, we recommend getting a mammogram every year. After that, 55 and older, switching to a mammogram every other year, or choosing to continue the yearly mammogram screening as long as they're in good health and expected to live more than 10 years past that mammogram point. So these are current recommendations, with the caveat that some studies indicate that there is little or no clinical value for mammograms under 50 years of age. So you may hear some material say that this is really not necessary to get a mammogram if you're under 50, but currently the current guidelines recommend mammograms, recommending to start them, having the option to start them at age 40. So it's a little up in the air, between 40 and 50 though. Importantly, with early mammographic detection in women over 50, more than 90% of breast cancers are being cured. That's great, right? That's 9 in 10, 90 out of 100 breast cancers are being cured when detected early. So regular mammogram screenings are useful in that way, right? Because if you don't detect it and the cancer progresses to the later stages, then life expectancy drops off significantly. But if you can detect it early, you can treat it early before it metastasizes, right? And give someone a good quality of life, or extend their life expectancy at least. Okay, so that's the talk about breast cancers. It's unfortunate though, right? That like the thing we use to detect breast cancer can give you breast cancer, right? Yes.
I know a lot of women now, they've been offered ultrasound instead.
Yeah,
They're kind of switching, it seems like.
absolutely. There's, I guess, the resolution that you get with ultrasound may be less, but I guess for people in certain conditions, certain symptoms, this is a good way to screen. Yeah, I would say ultrasound's great at looking at soft tissue, right? And which you can do with the breast is all soft tissue. Yeah, good option. And ultrasound is non-ionizing. It's just sound, right? So we're not using any forms of ionizing radiation. Okay, excellent. So let's go ahead and take a look now. Let's summarize everything we've done over these last two classes and see where we've come from and where we've made it to. Let's start off with summarizing our late effects that we just talked about today. So late effects are, starting off, teratogenic congenital defects. So remember, teratogenic congenital defects are effects that happen to the embryo or fetus. This is in utero exposure. And if we're talking about human length gestation periods, when's the riskiest time?
First 0 to 2 weeks.
0 to 2 weeks. 0 to 2 weeks. And what's the major risk during the 0 to 2 weeks? Spontaneous abortion. And if that doesn't happen, what does the embryo do? No, if it doesn't get spontaneously reabsorbed. Nothing happens. Happy baby, right? If it does get spontaneously reabsorbed, no one ever knows anything happened. Okay? So in that respect, like that's a pretty low risk one, 0 to 2 weeks. Like either reabsorb and you never know you were pregnant, or you have a happy, healthy baby. Okay? So really, from my standpoint, the 2 to 12 weeks of that first trimester is the big problem, right? Because 2 to 8 weeks organogenesis, you've got the risk of skeletal deformities. You've got the risk of neurological deformities going up during that time, and after the 8 to 12 weeks, you have the risk of mental retardation. You have the risk of what am I losing? Why am I losing it? Latent carcinogenesis, right? Those risks are continuously there up to about 12 weeks. After 12 weeks, the main risk now becomes latent carcinogenesis. So after that first trimester, all 3 trimesters of gestation are risky. They all pose a significant risk to the fetus during those developmental stages. But the first trimester is the biggest one, the biggest problem. So we call those teratogenic congenital defects, effects that happen from exposure in utero. So generally speaking, we try to avoid a known pregnant female from getting an X-ray exposure. This is one reason why you'll be asked before you do any X-ray exam on any female patient, asking them when their last menstrual period was, or the other question is, which is usually easier to ask, is there any chance that you're pregnant, right? What age range of people should you ask that question to? 12 to 60, like onset of puberty to roughly 60. Age 11, menopause, right? So stop asking them when they've gone through menopause, right? It's sort of a blurry kind of thing because, like, at the onset of puberty, you have the ability now to you're sexually mature, right? Or you are starting to sexually mature. So roughly speaking, just to remember something easy, and I know it's not perfect, and I've been slapped on the wrist for this. I ask between 8 and 80. Okay, because I know I'm safe, right? I know I'm safe if I'm gonna ask everyone within that age range. I know an 8-year-old's too young to get pregnant, but there's weird things happen in nature, right? The point is that ask any female in the reproductive age range if she could be pregnant, okay? And if the answer is anything but no, then you need to check, okay? I had this happen the other day where I asked the lady and she was like, well, maybe, and I'm like, are you pregnant? She's like, I don't know, maybe. I'm like, are you using contraception? No. When was your last menstrual period? I don't know. And I'm like, well, then I have to check you. She's like, no, it's fine. I'm not pregnant. I'm like, no, I can't now. I said, you've already told me that you don't know if you're pregnant, aren't using contraception, and don't know when your last menstrual period was. We've got to check you. And she like tried to do this whole like backstepping thing. I'm like, I'm sorry. Like, we now have to check. Like, I can't do the X-ray until I said, you said it. So, and it's no big deal, right? Like, I please leave a urine sample. We'll do an HCG test. Give us 3 minutes. Like, and we'll get an answer. She wasn't pregnant, luckily. But you got to ask, right? Because the one time you don't ask is the one time you're going to do the X-ray and find out she's pregnant, like later, right? And then she's gonna, her kid's gonna be born with a birth defect and come blame you. So please ask, okay? Everyone in the reproductive age range. I've had systems that will not let me perform the X-ray until I confirm that the patient's not pregnant on the computer. Like, you just won't let me get past that point. Yeah. So keep that in mind. We're worried about teratogenic defects, these ones, and especially at risk during that first trimester, in those first 3 periods during the first trimester. And remember, teratogenic defects followed a threshold, right? And they demonstrated a nonlinear response. The effect got worse with increase in exposure. That was evidenced by the rat pictures that I showed you. Okay. Mutagenic effects, hereditary effects that are congenital, so present at birth, but were caused by mutations to the gametes, the ovum, or the sperm cell, was irradiated, received an amount of radiation, mutated in some way, and that mutation was handed down to the offspring. That's what we call a congenital defect. The important thing to remember about mutagenic effects is that they are stochastic. No threshold, linear response. The likelihood of the effect happening is an all or none, and it either does or doesn't happen. Increases in likelihood with an increase in dose. And we said doses above 100 milligray, it's prudent to delay procreation. It is smart to not try to have a baby for a little while. Roughly 2 months for males, maybe a few days to up to 1 ovarian cycle for females. Lifespan shortening was a late effect. We compared that to a bunch of other things, right? Being unmarried and smoking and driving cars and all that other stuff, right? And we saw that there's no measurable, compared to other jobs, really no measurable change in length of lifespan for radiation workers. That was the point of that, right? We showed that, you're likely to lose about 40 days of life because you chose to work as an X-ray tech, but if you did any other job, it's about 74 days. So you're actually doing better than the other job. And you're only about 10 days, you're losing about 10 more days than the safest possible job, which I don't know what that is, but safest job, right? So we're pretty safe, in other words. Cataract of the lens of the eye, that was a somatic effect that was a late effect, 15 years to demonstrate, and has a threshold. So that was one that was an exception to our stochastic, to our late effects rule that late effects are stochastic. This one was a late effect that is deterministic. Cancers, on the other hand, lung cancer, thyroid cancer, bone cancer, breast cancers, those are completely stochastic, late effects. Different ones demonstrate different latency periods. All we can say is that they are mostly non-threshold and mostly linear in their response. Okay. Good. So those are our late effects. Let's go back and remind ourselves about what we talked about at the very beginning, the early effects. Early effects required significant exposures to happen. So not likely to happen in the diagnostic X-ray room. Suppressed blood counts, suppressed sperm counts, and suppressed menstruation. Temporary infertility or permanent sterility at extreme doses. Erythema of the skin. Epilation, hair loss. And then we went on to the really bad ones, right? The life-threatening ones. Above nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea syndrome, which happens at about 500 milligray all the way to 1 gray. That's our threshold. Nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea syndrome due to the disquamination of the small intestine, the flattening of the villi in the small intestine, where we lose the ability, temporarily in this case, to absorb nutrients, and there's a risk of dehydration or starvation. But the nice thing about NVD syndrome is because it happens from low levels, the intestines can repair themselves, and as long as you're able to stay hydrated, there's low risk of loss of life due to that. But go above 1 gray to the whole body, 1 gray and up, we now get into the acute radiation syndromes. The hematopoietic syndrome, the suppression of blood counts, which led to possibility of infection. gastrointestinal syndrome, which was the permanent damage to the villi of the small intestine, leading to the inability to absorb nutrients permanently, meaning that there's a high chance for loss of life. And the biggest risk in those cases was the dehydration within a few days or starvation within 10 to 21, something like that, a few weeks, right? I mentioned the rule of threes, and the textbook gives a slightly different number, but similar idea, right? You live days without water, weeks without food, okay? And with acute radiation syndromes, GI subsyndrome, your risk of loss of life is due to dehydration most likely. With the worst one being central nervous system syndrome, death due to intracranial pressure from hemorrhaging of blood vessels around the brain, and that happened above 50 gray. Okay. All of these effects early required high doses of radiation, well above routine diagnostic levels. They all demonstrated a threshold, okay? And that threshold was high. Most of these require whole body exposure to have happen, with partial body exposures can causing things like erythema and epilation. And the important thing about the early effects, as we just said, they don't happen at routine diagnostic levels, but importantly, we can cause the stochastic effects at routine diagnostic levels. Okay, so we want to worry about those. Remember, this is important right here, right? This is probably the most important thing we learn in radiation safety. That there's just, because of stochastic effects, there is no amount of radiation that is considered safe for the patient. Every amount comes with some risk, so it has to satisfy a risk-benefit analysis by the physician. The benefit has to outweigh the risk of doing the study. All right, gang, that's it for me today. So that was good. We had a good talk, I think.